Good day. Before I proceed with this video, just to remind any of you who are watching any of our videos on Rumble, where you can find all our channels, the Duran, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris, and where some of our videos now appear on Rumble's homepage. If you watch any of our videos on Rumble, you can go to the red maroon button at the top of the video, and if you press it, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join us on Locals, become a member of our Locals community, participate in our content creation, and join me for my live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Thank you. Now, let us proceed with latest developments in Ukraine and in the crisis in and around Ukraine. I say that, though it's important to stress that this is essentially a crisis confined to the West and to Europe. Once upon a time, a crisis in Europe of this nature would have been an all-dominating event, one which would have consumed attention in every country. But this is no longer quite the case anymore. I was reading a very interesting article by the British academic Martin Jakes, who's now based in China and who writes for, amongst other places, the Chinese newspaper Global Times, who makes precisely that point. He points out that with the change in the world economic and geopolitical environment, the United States, Europe, Russia, all of these parts of the world which dominated the 19th and 20th centuries just don't have the kind of effect, don't have the kind of dominance, global dominance, which they once did. And by the way, and this is a topic for another video, this is going to have important bearing on the playing out of the sanctions war. I would just add to all of that there's increasing indications, including a recent article which I read in the Washington Post. I'm not going to read extracts from it. The Washington Post takes a very tough line on the fact that its articles are paywalled, and so I prefer not to encroach too far on that by reading extracts from an article. But suffice to say that it turns out that the Western powers, including the United States, were disappointed by the recent debate in the UN General Assembly over Ukraine. Though 141 countries voted to support their resolution condemning Russia, the big hitters, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, others, refused to do so. And on top of that, it's becoming increasingly acknowledged that even amongst those countries which did vote for the resolution, many of them simply were going through the motions, and that actual support for the Western position was rather thin. I, by the way, read something fairly similar in the British media as well, with some suggestions in the British media that Western diplomats are actually extremely angry by what happened, and in particular by the fact that 17 African countries refused to support the resolution. So that, I think, further reflects the extent to which the world is moving on from the West, that period of Western global dominance, which began in the 16th century with the Spanish Empire and its expansions into the Americas and eventually into the Pacific as well, that period is gradually ending, perhaps not so gradually when looked at in historic terms. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to say about this crisis. It is not quite the all-consuming crisis that it might once have been. But since I live in Europe, and since most of my viewers, I believe, are based in Europe or in the United States, some in Russia too, by the way, I am going to focus again on the Ukraine crisis today, because it does seem to me that ultimately and overall it is the crisis which directly affects us. People in China and India might be more interested in the fact that China and India have just had apparently very successful and positive negotiations about resolving their conflict on their northern border. But though that is an enormously interesting fact in itself, and one which perhaps deserves a fuller discussion, which one day I will probably come round to making, it's not the topic that we're all talking about in Europe, where I live, or in the United States, or of course in Russia. So what are the latest developments in the Ukrainian crisis? Let me, before I proceed, once again repeat that my only information is what is available on open access, and secondly, that I am only able to assess in very broad stroke terms the latest military developments. I'm not a person with any sort of military background or any very great historic interest in military affairs. I'm not therefore the best person to give discussions about military developments or to assess the significance of any particular military battle. And of course, there's massive amount of argument and debate and discussion about what's going on, with each side no doubt producing its own stories. And that makes it, for someone like myself, even more difficult to get a clear picture, or at least to give a clear account of what's going on, given, as I said, that this is not an area in which I feel I have any special expertise. Nonetheless, it's possible to say a few things. Firstly, in the hours before I made this video, there was news of a massive Russian missile strike on a huge base. I think it's a former Soviet base and training ground near the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. Now, this is a huge area. It's apparently hundreds of square kilometers in size, but clearly this missile strike was very precisely targeted. And over the hours that followed, we learned that first 8 people were killed, and then that was revised upwards to 35, and then that's been revised further upwards to 65, at least in some places. Now, I'm not able to corroborate or confirm any of those claims, which are coming from various different sources, but it's clear that some very major incident took place. And I would add that Russian missile strikes on Lviv have not, or at least in the area around Lviv, have not been part of the pattern of this conflict up to now. So why did the Russians strike at this base at this time? And why was the effect of this destruction so devastating? Well, I can only guess. There is a great deal of speculation in the parts of the media that this is connected to certain comments made by the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, who gave a warning that Western arms supplies to Ukraine were potentially dangerous, and that Russia would reserve the right to take action, including military action, in response to them. Now, some people, in my opinion, misconstrued his rather bland words as suggesting a potential attack on some NATO or EU country. It seems to me altogether more plausible that these weapons are being transported to this particular base, and that what the Russians were striking was this particular base, and that some of the people, the personnel who were killed, were Ukrainian personnel. Apparently there were no NATO personnel there, or so we're told. Ukrainian personnel who were handling these weapons, and perhaps some of these volunteers, or mercenaries if you prefer, who have been arriving in Ukraine to join the battle from the West. So that could be what this is all about. Of course, I am in no position to say one way or the other, and I'm going to, however, add my own view that Western arms supplies to Ukraine at this point in time are both a case of too little too late, And secondly, they're remarkably ill-judged by any consideration. I say too little, too late, because they're not realistically going to change the tide of the battle at this time, and remarkably ill-judged because, again, they appear to support Ukraine in a war which, it remains my view, it has no prospect. Ukraine has no prospect of winning. The only likely outcome of Ukraine continuing this conflict for much longer is that more people will die, more damage will be done, and Ukraine will find itself eventually in an even weaker negotiating position. That's my own assessment, and as we will see in a moment, it seems as if one very powerful and important person shares it. But anyway, that's my assessment, and it seems to me to be borne out by what little information I can gather from the place, the part of the war, the area where the war is really happening, which is in eastern Ukraine, where, difficult though it is to get an accurate assessment of what is going on, it does seem to me as if the Russian forces and the militia of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, are continuing to make deep inroads into the key city of Mariupol, where the Ukrainian military is still trying to cling on. There's some reports, by the way, that those Ukrainian troops are now starting to run short of supplies. They are, whatever the truth of that, entirely encircled. Nobody, I think, disputes this. And where both the Russians and the militia of the two republics have also been extending the areas under their control, following their capture of the important town, the strategically important town of Volnovakha. Now, as to the latter, I should say that its capture has been confirmed by Zelensky himself, President Zelensky of Ukraine himself, and it was briefly the subject of a lead article in the London Times, which spoke of the town having been comprehensively destroyed. So I don't think there's any doubt that Volnovakha has indeed fallen to the Russians and to the militia, and that they are advancing beyond it. And I've also read in a place which I have to say, I'm going to say straight away, it's a Russian influence source, and I don't regard this information as reliable, but I did read that the cauldron around the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine has not only been closed shut, but that the various forces, the Russian forces, are now blocking all the roads so that there is no means any longer to escape from these encirclements, these cauldrons. The last point, by the way, about these Russian forces actually meeting and closing the trap, a bit like Stalingrad, I suppose, that I want to stress, I've read very much in passing somewhere, and I can't corroborate or verify it. I don't know. But that these troops, these Ukrainian troops in eastern Ukraine, are in effect encircled. I think that's basically been true now for several days. Further west, around Kiev and Kharkiv, it seems to me that the Russians are biding their time. They're still surrounding some of the most important cities, Sumy, Chernigov, and most of Kharkiv, and they've gradually, very gradually, been extending their control of the areas around Kiev, though the city is not yet entirely encircled. But it seems to me that the level of fighting in these areas is at a relatively low level, and I have to say straight away that I think that is because the Russians have chosen to keep it that way. The major focus of the fighting, which is very fierce, is not around Kiev or Kharkiv or Chernigov or any of these places where the Western media are based. It is in the southeast of Ukraine, in what was what was the area of the Donbass, which of course is now nominally broken away, and where Mariupol is being increasingly closely invested, and where the Ukrainian army in the Donbass is now almost entirely, or perhaps entirely, encircled and facing eventual defeat. So that's where the main focus of the battle is happening, or so at least it seems to me. Now, the fact that there is a gathering military crisis in eastern Ukraine, I suspect, is what explains a lot of the diplomatic activity which we have seen over the last couple of days. The first is that we've had telephone calls, or rather a video conference, between Putin and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, who, by the way, I consider to be deeply responsible for the outbreak of this conflict, and Emmanuel Macron of France. That was a tripartite conference, and it seems that the French and the Germans came to this meeting with Putin trying to persuade him to agree to an immediate ceasefire, and he refused. Now, I say that because that's the indications that I'm getting from the media in Europe, though there's been an uncertain lack of release of information about this meeting. But I suspect that the reason for the urgency in seeking a ceasefire, which is, I'm sure, what has been happening, is that there is growing alarm, growing concern about the position, Ukraine's military position in Donbass and in Mariupol. So Western governments, which are undoubtedly well aware of the true situation in eastern Ukraine, are now doing everything they possibly can to try to persuade Putin and the Russians to declare a ceasefire in order to preserve these Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. And I think that this also explains some of the really rather extraordinary comments that have been coming out of those two people who, I have to say, in my opinion, constitute the terrible duo who have been most responsible, in my opinion, for authoring this catastrophe. These are Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, and Josep Borrell, the EU's High Representative for External Relations, the EU's Foreign Minister, in other words. Now, these two people, before the conflict began, were amongst the most hardline in saying that the question of NATO's so-called open door was not up for discussion. Stoltenberg, in words I will never forget, actually went out and said that Russia had no right of veto, no right to argue over this question of NATO's so-called open door. Something, as I said, I found staggering. Anyway, it's very interesting to see, now that the war is actually happening, now that Ukraine is in the process of being defeated, or so it seems to me, that Stoltenberg and Borrell have changed their tune. Both of them, Borrell in an incredibly bitter and angry interview which he gave with French media, in which basically he accused Putin of every sin under the sun. He finally admitted that the decision to offer Ukraine NATO membership was a mistake and was a promise the Western powers were never in a position to fulfill. And Stoltenberg has now gone ahead and said that NATO membership for Ukraine was never on anybody's agenda, it was never intended, it was never expected to happen soon, and therefore, and for that reason, it's a shame, I suppose, that this war happened. All I would say is, if Stoltenberg and Borrell had said these things, which they are saying now, about the fact that Ukraine would never get NATO membership at any proximate time, or indeed at any time, before this conflict started. And if they'd been prepared to give the Russians something in writing to confirm that, there is a high probability, I would say practically a certainty, that this war would have been avoided. And if it had been combined with a serious effort to make the Minsk agreements effective, to persuade Ukraine to fulfill its part of the Minsk agreements, which of course Ukraine always said it would eventually fulfill but never did. If that had also happened, and if Borrell and Stoltenberg and other Western leaders had actually talked to Ukraine to actually try to get it to accept that kind of reasoning and logic, well, again, I am sure we would never have had this war. Whoever one blames for this war, it seems to me that the responsibility of the Brussels bureaucracies, of Borrell and Stoltenberg, of NATO and the EU bureaucracies, and of Borrell and Stoltenberg in particular, must be assessed as very high. And of course, the same must also apply to Western governments. Now, it's not just Borrell and Stoltenberg who are, of course, saying these things. And it's not, of course, just Scholz and Macron who are trying desperately to get some kind of end to the conflict and to get some kind of ceasefire agreed, a ceasefire to end the conflict in Ukraine so as that the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine survives in some form. The United States has been trying to do this as well. And what we now see is an intensification of attempts by the US to play the only card that I think they may have, which is to try to persuade China to actually lean on Russia to announce a ceasefire. And that possibly explains why Jake Sullivan, the US's, the administration's, in my opinion, deeply incompetent national security advisor, is now announced that he wants to meet Yang Jiechi, China's Xi Jinping's national security advisor, in Rome next week. The intention apparently is to discuss, or at least Sullivan's intention at least, is to discuss Ukraine. I suspect, and in fact I am sure, judging from everything I've been reading in the Chinese media, that if Sullivan thinks that he can persuade the Chinese to lean on the Russians to agree a ceasefire, he's going to be bitterly disappointed. In fact, I think what he's going to find is that the Chinese are going to stick to the position that they have taken all along, which is that the reason that there is this conflict in Ukraine is because of the West's determination to go on extending NATO eastwards and to reject Russia's request for legally binding security guarantees. And I think Yang Jiechi is going to say to Sullivan that it is not China's job to put pressure on Russia. That's not what the Chinese do. If the US has a problem with Russia, then it must negotiate with Russia and try to come to terms with the Russians directly. It's not China's job to be a messenger boy. And I expect that the Chinese, for their part, will come up with a whole list of points and concerns that they will want to make about the issue of Taiwan, where I would say that even as we are talking all about Ukraine, the situation has in fact become increasingly tense and is deteriorating, though nowhere near to the point of crisis that we've had in Ukraine over the last few months. So I think that Sullivan is heading for another debacle in his meeting with Yang Jiechi in Rome, and I think he's going to find the Chinese extremely unwilling to move in the kind of way that he wants them to. Anyway, that's what I expect. I said earlier in the program that there is one important person who appears to be trying to get the Ukrainians to accept reality. And that is Prime Minister Bennett of Israel. Now, I have to say here that we're getting lots of reports about what he's been telling the Ukrainians, but these reports, or even though they've been circulating in the Israeli media, have been contradicted by the Israeli government and to some extent by Ukraine itself, even though these reports originated with a Ukrainian official. But the story is that Bennett went on a private, or at least not exactly a secret or private, but a rather discreet visit to Moscow, had a meeting with Putin. It was a meeting about which neither the Israelis nor the Russians have disclosed very much. And Bennett afterwards supposedly telephoned Zelensky. And according to these claims, Bennett told Zelensky that Ukraine had no realistic alternative but to accept Russia's demands and sue for peace on that basis. And apparently Zelensky was deeply upset and said no, and said that he would not capitulate. And some Ukrainian official subsequently, several days after the call, by the way, leaked this fact to the media, which, as I said, has denied that this conversation actually took place. Now, what, if I can say, are those Russian demands? Firstly, an admission, an agreement by Ukraine that it will not enter NATO. Now, the Ukrainians have been saying all kinds of things about this over the last couple of days, but Zelensky has, in public, essentially accepted this. He has accepted that Ukraine will not join NATO. And what he's looking for now is for third parties as well as Russia to guarantee Ukraine's security. Again, if I may say so, if this had been agreed, if this had been said just 4 weeks ago, so much would have been avoided. Now, I think that the Russians will not just accept assurances from Zelensky. They will want something a lot more concrete than statements by him. They've spoken about changes to Ukraine's constitution, and I think they will also want guarantees that that constitutional assurance is not going to be reversed. But anyway, that's one thing that Zelensky appears to be moving towards the Russians, the one point that he's moving towards the Russians on. The second is this cleansing of the ultra-right from Ukraine. I'm going to avoid referring to the 1930s, 1940s German political movement, whose name is attached to these right-wing forces in Ukraine, especially by the Russians, but by many other people as well. So the Russians want something to be done about these people. Again, I think there'll be a lot of opposition to this in Ukraine from some of the important people in the power structure. But I'm going to make a guess. I think that others would be far from averse to throwing these people, these ultra-right people, under a bus. It's difficult to convey the cynicism of much of the way in which politics in Ukraine has been conducted over the last 30 years. And though I think some of the important figures in the power structure, the so-called oligarchs, people like that, have been happy to work with these ultra-right people in order to achieve their own political objectives, fundamentally they owe them no loyalty. And I think that is true on the part of Zelensky himself. So I think that if there's some kind of deal done to try and dismantle their apparatus and organization, to send these people away, perhaps to Western Ukraine, to find some way of breaking up their military structures, well, that might be possible. The third thing that the Russians say they want is the demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, that might be a little bit more complicated, but if Ukraine is prepared to accept neutrality, then again, some kind of reduction in the scale of its military might become feasible. The sticking point is the status of Crimea and of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Russians say that they want Ukraine to recognize them. The Ukrainians up to now have been saying that they won't, though again Zelensky has shown some flexibility on this issue, or at least he has spoken as if he might have some flexibility on this issue. Whether he really does or whether he doesn't, I have absolutely no idea. But I'm going to say this, it's been completely ignored, but over the last 2 days, direct negotiations between the Ukrainian and Russian negotiating teams have resumed. Now, they're not meeting face-to-face in Belarus. They're meeting through virtual contacts. And apparently, and this is an important breakthrough or potential breakthrough, they've now agreed to set up working parties. Now, in my experience, when people do set up working parties over a course of a negotiation, it's a sign that they're working towards some sort of agreement. And that maybe, I hope it is, the case here. Now, that agreement will then presumably be sealed in a summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin, in which some kind of document will have been prepared and which will then be put to the respective parliaments, the Duma in Moscow and the Rada in Kiev, for ratification. And Zelensky has floated the idea that Jerusalem, the place where Bennett, the capital, or rather, I know that's controversial with some people, the place which the Israelis claim is the capital of their country. I'm going to, for the purpose of this video, call it the capital. The capital of the country of which Prime Minister Bennett, the person who gave that advice to Zelensky, well, he is the Prime Minister of that country. So there would presumably be a summit meeting, perhaps in Jerusalem, perhaps somewhere else. There would be a legal document of some kind, and that would be presented to the two parliaments for ratification. And that would be the end of the conflict. And it would be the end of a conflict on what I expect will be essentially Russian terms. It will mean the end of Ukraine's quest for NATO membership. It will be the end of the attempt to recapture the Donbass by force. And it will probably be the end, in fact, I'm no doubt about this, it will be the end of any thought of Ukraine trying to cling on to Crimea. Now, there is a further complication, which is that over the last couple of days, Ukraine made what I suspect was a last desperate bid to try to enlist Western support by asking for accelerated EU membership. But it has become entirely clear that that too is not on offer. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. It's possible that this initiative of Ukraine's EU membership might be revived after the end of this conflict. But I have to say realistically, I think that is extremely unlikely. It could be that this request for EU membership that the Zelensky government made was simply another way for that government to show to the Ukrainian people that in this conflict, Ukraine is, to all intents and purposes, left to itself, and that the Western powers, for all the brave talk that they've undertaken over these last few years, for all the sanctions on Russia that they have imposed, ultimately, they're not prepared to stand by Ukraine in any way that is meaningful. So with the EU having rejected Ukraine's request for immediate membership, it seems to me that perhaps the last step has been taken in sorting out some kind of negotiation. Now, I want to make this clear. None of this is guaranteed. It's very possible, given the enormous conflicts and disputes that are happening within Ukraine over this issue, that at the very last moment, these negotiations will fall apart. Now, if we go back to the telephone call between Zelensky and Bennett, that telephone call was supposed to be confidential, but some Ukrainian source appears to have leaked to the Israeli media the fact that Bennett basically advised Zelensky to accede to Russia's demands. And that suggests to me that some Ukrainian source, that source may have been someone within Ukraine who is trying to sabotage the negotiation, the progress of the negotiation towards the kind of settlement that I'm outlining. I don't know. We shall see. But there are lots and scores of things that could go wrong, and no one should assume that we are indeed anywhere close to an end game here. But the fact remains that some kind of negotiation is indeed underway, even as the situation of the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine looks like it is becoming increasingly critical. We could start to be approaching the end of this particular crisis. Now, I will say straight away, even if that happens, nothing will ever be the same again. And I'm going to discuss in another video soon some of the economic consequences of this, the meaning, or to be more precise, complete lack of meaning of the US decision to revoke Russia's most favored nation status. I will simply say in parentheses that that's never been effective. That whole project was sabotaged from the start. It's never really worked out in the way that it was intended to, for all sorts of reasons, which we'll discuss, as I said, in a further video. But the important point to understand is that the unified global system created largely by the United States and the various people who support that process of globalization after the Cold War has, in my opinion, irrevocably fractured. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is where we are at the moment. Missile strikes on bases in western Ukraine, the full reasons for which have not been disclosed, but which appear to have done heavy material damage and cost the lives of many people. A tightening of the noose around the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine, or the Donbass, if you prefer. Again, this is something that I've gleaned from what I've been reading. I can't confirm all the details. And a negotiating process which may be heading to some sort of conclusion. And in the meantime, the United States trying to find some kind of understanding of the Chinese position, trying to engage China in discussions, with the Chinese playing their cards, as always, with extreme skill. Well, thank you for joining me again today. No doubt there'll be much more to discuss soon, perhaps tomorrow. And as I said, at some point before very long, I'm going to do a program about some of the economic shifts that have been happening as a result of this crisis, which I expect to be permanent. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. And remember what I said about, you can find us on Rumbles and Locals and also on other platforms. Links under this video. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video also. You can also, by the way, support us by going to our shop and buying the things you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.